Hello, I'm Anna de la Vega and welcome to the 6th episode of Flute Reboot on IDAGIO Live, the place where classical music happens. This episode is the last in season 1. Then I will take a little break before hitting the Romantic period and beyond, 20th century music, and also episodes on the legendary characters in flute playing like Marcel Moyse, Jean-Pierre Rampal, and James Galway. So far on Flute Reboot, and if you haven't listened, I can highly recommend it. We discovered the origins of this ancient instrument, its development from Renaissance military folkish pipe through Versailles and Louis XIV, its debut in orchestra, its enormous popularity in Potsdam with Joachim Quantz and Frederick the Great, and over to Italy last week for Vivaldi's amazing all-girls orphanage, which was the origins of the conservatorium. And we discovered that conservati are orphans, meaning the saved, hence the word conservatorium. And I was thinking since that it's actually perfectly fitting in the modern world. All us music students are actually just little orphans who left our homes to study music abroad in foreign countries. So classical musicians are largely displaced and alone during their studying years. And so our journey now arrives at Mozart. And here we have a big problem. For 250 years, we have been suffering from the belief that Mozart, the king of composition, the unsurpassable legend, hated the flute. So I have called this episode the Mozart Myth. Legend says Mozart hated the flute. History says he was chasing girls. Now, one particular letter from Mozart to his father in 1777 is responsible for this belief. And it reads, "My dear father, blah, 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 blah. You know that I become quite powerless whenever I'm obliged to write for an instrument that I cannot bear." So that I cannot bear. And for the past 250 years, on the strength of these words, audiences, historians, flutists have believed that Mozart hated the flute. But can it really be so? And today I want to talk about that, because there is a confusing, ironic disparity between this idea and the beauty of the music which he has written for the flute. The music is just far too beautiful for one to believe he disliked this instrument. The concerto in G major is a masterwork. The Andante is in C is exquisite. The flute quartets are amazing. And the Flute and Harp Concerto, the slow movement in particular, takes us to like a whole otherworldly dimension of beauty. But then Mozart told the joke, what's worse than the sound of a flute? Two flutes. So why did he write these pieces? I have to admit they were commissions, of course. So he was paid by flutists or flute enthusiasts to write them, and so it was not by choice. We also have to acknowledge that his flute compositions are beautiful, perhaps because Mozart is just Mozart and he just wasn't able to write anything that was not immensely beautiful. And so it doesn't necessarily argue that he felt warmly towards the flute. But if we look at the way he has electively written for the flute within his symphonies and concertos for other instruments, so the role he has given the flute within orchestral works, then it becomes almost impossible to believe he hated this instrument. So it's widely agreed that Mozart sort of made stars of the woodwinds in his symphonies, particularly from the Prague on, so the last 4 symphonies. In fact, he's considered really the most important link between the string-heavy Baroque orchestras or early symphonies to the lush and more varied sounds of Beethoven orchestra and post-Beethoven orchestra. And flutes were given a lot of material, important material. But orchestration was a moving target at this time. Mozart was a pioneer. He could define his own woodwind section and what role each instrument should be given. But the flutes were front and center, and in his last 6 symphonies, apart from the Linz Symphony, he has scored and used flutes profusely, totally by choice. So further, his most famous opera, the Magic Flute. It's not unreasonable to think that this genius composer could write for an instrument he didn't really like, but it seems unlikely that Mozart would have composed an opera about the instrument's magical power to transform human passion, because that is what the Magic Flute is about, the flute's magical power to transform human passion. And the three ladies tell Paganino, the sad will become happy and the stony-hearted affectionate. If he himself did not believe a part of that. So in my opinion, and not only my opinion, his letter to his father cannot be taken at face value. So let's look at the conditions under which he wrote it, an instrument that I cannot bear. During the 18th century, the flute was a favorite instrument of the aristocrats, perpetrated largely by Frederick the Great's love of the instrument. And subsequently, there was a wave of sort of flute mania. And a lot of people with money were commissioning works for the flute. In 1777, a wealthy Dutch amateur flautist called Dijon commissioned 3 concertos and a couple of flute quartets. But Mozart failed to deliver the works on time. He had procrastinated, annoyed the Duke, and ended up not being paid in full. And his father found out about this. Now, his relationship with his father was extremely volatile. I have read all the letters between the two, and Leopold Mozart is the reigning supreme master of guilt manipulation. He was overambitious for his son, obsessive about money, criticizing him, pushing him, punishing him. So Mozart's father at this time was probing for an explanation, and this letter can be compared to the remark of a procrastinating 22-year-old student who's making excuses for not finishing his homework, essentially. Now, why hadn't he finished the works? Because he had met and fallen in love with Aloysia Weber. He actually ended up marrying her sister, Constanze, in the end, but that's a whole other story. And here, and he was busy chasing her around Mannheim and writing her arias and piano pieces instead of writing these flute works. And Dijon's flute composition turned into quite an annoying task, interfering with his lady plans. Mozart did, however, deliver 2 concertos and 3 flute quartets. There is a 4th flute quartet he wrote later in Vienna. So in total, we do have 4. But this poor Dutchman, not only was Mozart's commissions late and he didn't ever complete the commission, but the works were not even newly written. Mozart had run out of time. He fishes into the bottom of his suitcase, pulls out a concerto he had written for somebody else in Salzburg, but had brought it with him, fixes it up a bit and turns it into the G major flute concerto. And another concerto he'd written for the oboe in C major, he transposes up a tone, whacks it in D, adds a few fluty runs and melodic leaps, and gives it to Dijon. So essentially recycled music. Dijon was not impressed, pays him half the fee, and Mozart's father was beside himself. So Mozart turns around and essentially says, you know, well, it's just really tough writing for an instrument that I don't like, Dad. And there we have an explanation. But all in all, there, amidst his wild love affair and his procrastinating and his pulling old manuscripts out of his suitcase, we have the most valuable and beautiful music of our entire repertoire. What a man. Now I'm going to play you snippets of these concertos, and I'm actually going to play you my own recording, because you sit there listening to me bang on about the flute weekly and I haven't played you a single note except for on beer bottles. So here is my recording with my beloved English Chamber Orchestra. Firstly, we will listen to a bit of the D major flute concerto first movement. And now I'm going to play you a snippet of the G major slow movement, which he has written for an instrument that he only hated. So you're probably wondering how this music was played on the one-keyed traverso flute, because it's quite demanding. While Mozart was in Paris, the flute had now developed into a 4-key machine. And now I'm going to show you actually what those flutes were now looking like, because that's really significant. This bottom flute here is the 6-hold 1-key traverso we've been talking about. And up here, you will see what is now happening. And this is now we're moving into the era of what's called keyed flutes. So here we have 4 little keys, then we have 5, then we have 6, 7, 8, and then eventually the whole system is redone by Böhm in the mid-1800s, which I'll talk about later. Now, in the very first episode, I introduced you to, one second. Yes, to the piece that brought me to the flute, the thing that captured my spirit and imagination and drove me to travel to the other side of the world and make European music my home and my mission. And that was Mozart's Flute and Harp Concerto. It was written in 1778 when Mozart was in Paris. And this was, especially for back then, a really random combination of instruments, flute and harp. The harp was not even an orchestral instrument yet, and this is the only work that Mozart ever wrote for the harp. So why? Mozart had a composition student in Paris called Marie-Louise Philippine, and she was the daughter of Duc de Guidon. And the Duke played the flute and Marie played the harp. And the Duke had just got himself a 6-keyed flute from London. So everyone was playing the 4-key, but the English flute makers were becoming really progressive in adding keys. And the Duke had ordered one from London, which had just arrived. So he commissioned this work from Mozart so that he would be able to play with his daughter. And the 6-keyed flute was vastly improved over the 4-key instrument. And Mozart really took advantage of this it could now cope with middle C. And this concerto, the Flute and Harp Concerto, has 3 middle Cs to show off this possibility. Obviously, I have my reasons for dismantling the idea that Mozart hated the flute, but you will trust me more if I argue both sides. So there is something that could have contributed to a disliking for the flute. As mentioned, there was the flute became super vogue among royalty and aristos after Frederick the Great, and here may lie the problem. Kings, noblemen, amateurs, valets, they were all playing it. So essentially, like a lot of fancy people playing badly, and the better flautists overcame technical and tuning difficulties. But in Mozart's early time, this was the one key traverso, which was imperfect and very difficult to play. Holes were still being placed according to the anatomy of the players. It was less likely that many people were playing this really wonderfully well unless they were highly skilled or playing with great care. And the keyboard was now equal tempered. So there may have been a combination of these 2 issues, the flute's slow evolution and the immense popularity in the upper classes, that it was an instrument of amateurs really, and played possibly quite badly at every court that Mozart visited. And we experienced this last week with Scarlatti the Elder in Naples. When Quantz turned up, he said, "Oh God, no, don't talk to me about, wind instruments, they're all out of tune." But then he heard Quantz and he was like, "Oh, okay," and wrote for him. So it's the same issue here. But on balance, if we take the number of beautiful works written by Mozart for the flute, the opera, the Magic Flute, and its ovation of the instrument, and the way he electively uses the flute in his concertos and particularly in his later symphonies, and of course, lastly, that his comment, "I cannot bear this instrument," was clearly a desperate attempt to defend the mess up of the commission to his furious father, I am maintaining that Mozart hating the flute is a myth, and he was just chasing girls. Thank you very much for coming on this journey with me for season 1 of Flute Reboot for IDAGIO Live. I'm going to be taking a couple of weeks off, so stay tuned on my social media channels for the next episode, which will be coming shortly. And most importantly, take care.